Okay, trying this again. I think this is better. I think this is better. Looking at my little bouncy audio thingy, this looks okay. Checked the recorded playback, seemed to be okay, so I'm just gonna roll with it. Okay, jumping to jump to my screen. Cool. So I'm calling this the era of CSS AF, or rather architecture free. Um, So before I get into this, I want to say a little bit about my workflow, just in case you're curious. So for non-coding related things, I like to use very lightweight applications just to write notes or whatever it is. So Sublime is a very, very good one. It's super fast compared to things like Atom or VS Code or anything like that. So I typically use Sublime, MacVim, or Vim just to write stuff. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to be using Sublime. Um, so I don't want to go too much into, I guess, the history of CSS and how it's kind of evolved and used within applications. Um, I'll touch upon that a little bit, but I'll focus on how Help Scout used CSS, I guess, in the past. By in the past, I mean just a couple of years ago, even just a year ago, compared to what we're doing now. And there's been a dramatic shift in terms of how we write and how we think about CSS, and it's become a lot better in my opinion. So in the beginning, I mean, CSS has always been very different if you're going to build something with it for application, like as an application. Um, Website and application CSS is totally different. Um, Application CSS gets very complicated very quickly, and it grows to ginormous sizes, and is often, very often, written by either multiple folks or folks who might not specialize in CSS or feel particularly comfortable or enjoy doing it, or a combination of both, which exponentially makes the CSS more difficult to work with. So if you're working on a personal website, a simple website, or some sort of agency-based thing, the CSS you need to write is just typically like either simple or some sort of one-shot deal where you can write whatever you want and it'll be fine. And if you need to make any other updates, well, just rewrite everything again. It's no big deal. But with applications, there's a lot of things that have to go on in terms of what your UI has to handle, how it renders, how it interacts. On top of that, your application will get increasingly more complex over time. So your code base has to grow and scale in that manner. And front-end code in particular has done a, we're only starting to figure out how to do that because the majority of the logic and all that kind of stuff lived in the back end for the longest time. It's only been in recent years where we started doing full applications on the front end using JavaScript. And now more than ever with things like React and so on. Um, so with Help Scout, the majority of the things rendering the HTML logic was written in PHP for the most part, and eventually started to do some JavaScript things. Um, and what CSS, how you're supposed to think about and write CSS is, this is the visual presentational layer that paints onto the structure, the HTML structure that you've declared in your website. In other words, it stylizes whatever it is you told the website your page to render. Um, And there's always been this decoupling between the style layer, being CSS, and also the markup layer. Not JavaScript, not PHP, whatever, markup. And the markup can comprise of whatever it is that you use to render HTML. It could be in the PHP world, it could be Smarty, it could be Twig. CSS world, JavaScript world, it could be handlebars, mustache, JSX, whatever it is. Whatever it is that renders the HTML, that's what I'm talking about. And the CSS's job is to style that. Um, So because of this decoupling and this scaling problem, folks have come up with a lot of different conventions as to how you're supposed to think about and write CSS. The first kind of one that started becoming popular was Object-Oriented CSS, written by, or this concept was come up with, believe Nicole Sullivan came up with this one. This was very cool. Bootstrap, the original Bootstrap, leveraged this technique very heavily, and also Foundation CSS back in the day, which eventually became Bootstrap. And then they kind of diverged and split. And the idea for Orientated CSS was, instead of randomly declaring your styles to style arbitrary things on your page, you would think about bits of UI like components. And this was sort of in the era before components became more of a thing. So you would think about your UI like cards, buttons, tables, and so on, and then write CSS accordingly. And you would then be able to reuse these styles as you scale and construct and build your UI. So that was really nice. And then there are other kind of philosophies kind of came about from this. There was SMAX. I forget what this acronym stands for, but it kind of expands beyond object-oriented CSS. I'm going to label this under arc CSS architectures. So this one expanded beyond object-oriented CSS, and it included the concept of having pages and I think sections, so that you would style larger things on top of components, which is cool, because that's what's required. You need to render pages and sections and all that kind of stuff sometimes, and also modifiers to modify how your button or your table or whatever it is looks. Because, I mean, a button can render, and I can't remember the amount of ways, like 700 plus, something like that. You can have large, small, primary, secondary, tertiary, whatever buttons, and you need to have styles that kind of can take care of all those different variations without you having to rewrite things all the time. So the idea of this modifier thing came into play. And then BEM became a thing, block element modifier. And this kind of came about to solve the problem of when you see a lot of markup that looks like, I don't know, thing. No, I'm gonna give them real class names. Let's say a table. Okay, this is a very awful set of class names, but it's fine. Oh, no. Here, card, and then you have some header, and then you have some title like so. Right. This is not super semantic or anything. That's not the point of whatever I'm trying to say. Semantics is a whole nother talk. So with object-oriented CSS and SMAX, you might have some layout that looks like this. But over time, it becomes very unclear as to how this may be affected by this, because you're using very seemingly generic class names like header. It's very basic. These feel like basic components, but maybe within a card, the header works a little bit differently. So that's where BEM came into play, block element modifier. The block is basically the most parentist entity, being the block or the component or whatever. So we have a card, and then you would specify child elements within. So if you do this, and that's done with this underscore syntax. And now very clearly, just by looking at this markup, you'll be able to understand the hierarchy of the elements within and the styles related to them. And the M stands for modifier. So if you had multiple cards like so, whoops, maybe this is like a tiny card and this is a big card. So you would use the hyphen convention to modify the styles of a particular block or component or whatever it is however it is you prefer to think about it. And you're able to do this without having to change the markup, which is nice. You're able to have aesthetic or visual differences within things just by applying a single modifier. And this changed the game, I think. This made folks who used to be scared of CSS feel a little bit more comfortable because there was some sort of sense as to what was going on. And then the other I mean, I might be skipping a couple here and there, but I'm just mentioning like the really big ones. And the next big one was ITCSS. ITCSS stands for Inverted Triangle CSS. It basically specifies that you would have your most generic, imagine a triangle, you'd have the most generic classes, your base foundational classes at the top, and then you gradually work your way down to something more specific. So you would have your base styles. That could be things like styling the default HTML, or all the tables, or having your normalizer or reset or something at that level. And then you build your little components, and then you would and you basically work your way upwards in terms of what you're styling. And as you do that, the specificity increases as well. So the next one would kind of be, they call them sections. It could be pages, however it is you like to imagine them, where you would maybe have your card component look slightly differently within the pricing page. So instead of maybe doing something like this, card pricing, you would have instead some sort of parent element called say pricing, and then you would have the pricing card styles live in this kind of area. And the last one would be, he called them, this one is Harry Roberts. He created a site called CSS Wizards, very, very smart person. He created something called trumps, which are, these are where the bang important, I know what I'm doing overrides live. And that's basically it. As you work your way downwards within your CSS file, the specificity goes up, and also whatever the size of whatever it is you're styling. So you start off with the base foundational stuff, very generic rules like HTML or input or whatever it is you need. Then you start creating your components like input components, and then you're creating your pages and stuff. So you'd have like pricing input. And then lastly, you would have your trumps. So it looked like input. Fantastic. Fantastic. Some style, so maybe you make your color pink, bang important. And this one's really interesting because even though whatever styles you have written here loads later within the file, right? It's a little bit lower down. This, whatever you have here, so if I had color black, color red, color blue, color green. So how your browser or whatever engine that's processing the CSS will first, it'll look through the entire thing. It'll try to render the color of green. But if your input happens to have this class name on it, it'll override it with this color because this rule is more specific than this one. It's more powerful. And if you stack class names like that, it increases the power. The more class names you stack, the more powerful it is. So here, this is double class name, which beats this one. And once we get to this part, whoops, misspelled fantastic. Even though this one appears later in the file, some arbitrary place in the file later, because this is a singular class name, this one overrides it. And the idea for the trumps are, regardless of how specific this particular class name is, and regardless of where wherever it is you use it, whether this is like 5 levels deep or anything, always follow this rule. And it's very tempting to just stick all your importance in there, and that's not how you're supposed to do things. These are like, I know what I'm doing, trust me, make it this way. And a good place to put your trumps would be utility classes. So if you had some utility classes like, I don't know, margin bottom 10, these are bad class names. But you know, I mean, if you have classes like this, you know exactly what you're doing. You use like margin bottom 10. The other idea that ITCSS introduced, which is amazing within the realm of CSS, is prefixing. So you would prefix your classes based on what they are. So C, they had different prefix letters. So C would stand for component. So here I have my component, and I'll just make my adjustments here. So we were doing inputs. Let's stick with inputs. No, sorry, let's stick with cards. So you have generic div. Okay, there we go. So now I have a C card header, C card things. That's not D card, C card. Right. And then for sections, they would have the S modifier. And for utilities, like this Trump guy right here, you'd have the U. So when you start combining classes together like this, U margin bottom 10, just by looking at, once you understand the triangle, you'll be able to see very clearly just by looking at the markup, and you'll be able to imagine how the flow of things go. So I understand by looking at this, I have a pricing section of some kind based on the name, which is nice. And there is a card that lives inside the pricing section. The pricing section has a margin bottom of 10. The card, here, I'm not even gonna look at the styles. Let's just look at this. Yeah, cool. So the card may or may not be adjusted within the pricing section, but I'm going to assume that it's not. And now we have headers and titles that belong to the card. Cool. Yeah, so that was the kind of relationship that ITCSS, BEM, and all those things have tried to do with HTML. Basically, bringing the styles closer to the markup code. And when the closer it becomes, the easier the context switching becomes. Because now, just by looking at the markup, you can understand what the styles are. Whereas before, the classes were bad, man. You might have had something where it's just like, I don't know, if you're lucky, page, no class div, none of that, maybe an H1, maybe. You might have something that looks like this. I'm not going to call it page, I'm going to P. Why not? So the difference between this and this is staggering. Because by looking at this, I have no idea what the heck is going on. But here, it becomes a little bit more clear. But we're still within the realm of architecture. And the last final one, since I just remembered this after looking at the trumps, is atomic CSS, or atomic design, however it is you want to call it, created by Brad Frost. And that is the idea of creating lots and lots of little pieces and then combining them to construct something. So you wouldn't necessarily have a card component if you were to follow that kind of atomic rule. You would have like, I don't know, okay, you might have a card component, but a card piece. But like, let's say you wanted to render some sort of UI that had a card with a photo and all that kind of stuff inside. You would create lots and lots of these little utility-based classes, combine them together, and then you would get the result that you're looking for. A really good example would be something like, say, so maybe it has some black text class styles. Maybe I have some um, padding styles that adjust the horizontal things on the left and the right. Maybe it had some hover styles that change the background to red. I don't know. Maybe the default background color is blue and so on. So you have lots of these little tiny pieces. And then you would, and for me, in order to build, say, a button, you would do something like this. Pending H10, hover BG red, BG blue. I'm just making these class names up, by the way. So now, by combining all of your little classes, you get a stylized button. And it's still kind of easy to read. I can kind of understand what's going on with this guy. And this pattern is basically was pushed very heavily by a framework called Tachyons, also created by very, very smart folks. I believe that's how you spell it. I spell it wrong sometimes. But the idea was you'd basically have a foundation of all these little classes, and you would combine them together, and you build every single UI that you need. That means your CSS stays super, super tiny because you're not writing additional CSS. You are instead combining your CSS to create stuff. But I personally, don't like this particular pattern if you follow it, if you just have base foundational classes. The reason for that is if you're working within a language that does, or a framework or an application or setup that doesn't have this idea of super tiny components. So, I mean, this is more older code-based stuff. So pre-React, older Vue, Angular, Backbone, Marionette, Ember, jQuery, that level in terms of just JavaScript and any kind of, basically any backend based language, Ruby, PHP, Laravel, so on. You'd be basically copying and pasting markup like this all over the place just to construct your button. And man, when you copy and paste markup, that's where divergence, that's where things can go wrong and you don't know why. Because you just have a combination of all these classes and now things are difficult to read and the complexity of the scaling has been abstracted away from your CSS and into your markup, which in my opinion is way worse. Because this is way harder to control, I think, compared to this. Because you'd have a lot more things that render markup than you do styles. What I like, the pattern that I like, if you're still following the realm of CSS architecture, is a combination of the spirit of what you get with tachyons being lots of little combining classes with components, similar to what you'd get within a OOO CSS framework like Bootstrap or Foundation or Bulma. There's a lot of them. So you'd have something that looks like this. See BT, or in Bootstrap it'd be BTN, but if we're doing ITCSS, it'd be component BTN. I'm just gonna write it. Right? So I'd have my little button guy here. But if I wanted to modify the button in a certain way, let's say I have a U, MRG for margin, bottom, B for bottom, 10. So here, I'm not constructing UI with my little classes. I'm tweaking it, enhancing it as required for my view. And thankfully, this combination of like component plus utility sprinkling extra classes has become more of a thing. So within Bootstrap 4, they've added a ton of utility classes that you're able to customize your components as you need to. And I think within the realm of CSS architecture, that's basically the best you're going to get from a foundational standpoint. From a framework standpoint, anything you write in addition to that is all up to you. But most likely, hopefully, you're following some sort of convention or a combination of any of these, because these are really nice. I mean, this is all we got in the realm of CSS. So now let's get to the architecture free. What does that mean? Did I spell this right? I hope I did. Give me a second. Googling how to spell. Where's my tab? Always spell this word wrong. Yes, you got it right. Cool. So there's only really two ways you can do architecture-free CSS right now. Two primary ways. I mean, there's lots of ways to do a lot of things, but two primary ways. One is you would literally write inline styles to style your guy. Background red, color white. Yeah. And I mean, you could have done this since the beginning of building your application, HTML and so on. And I think a lot of backend folks kind of did, because this was a way where you were guaranteed to render whatever it is you wanted onto this particular element. And this was very heavily frowned upon, just because, I mean, it's fine for this one shot, but it's not reusable. And that's where the problem lies. The spirit of this, I think it's fine. But the overall scaling and execution of this, that's where the problem is. Because let's say you had lots of these to then construct your card. And if you wanted your card to render in lots of different places and you didn't have some sort of component set up, then you'd have to copy and paste this code all over the place. And you basically run into the same problem as that tachyon example that I showed earlier, except now you're dealing with inline styles, which you cannot override unless you use important, and that's where things get dramatically worse. But with new modern 2019 based tooling, and let's assume that you're writing some sort of SPA using front-end frameworks and languages like React. We now have things like styled components, emotion, and fancy, which is our version of emotion, that can now successfully combine the styles with the little tiny piece of component that you want to render. And so those things kind of look like this. So I'm going to use styled components as an example. Import styled from styled components, I think. So if I wanted to create a styled button, you would have something that looks like this. Styled button. I may be wrong on some of the syntax. I don't use styled components personally. Oh my God. Okay, stop it. Markdown. I am turning this back to plain text. Great. This is why I like no syntax highlighting. It doesn't get in your way. So yeah, so if I'm gonna make this a background color of red and some color of white, similar to kind of what, I don't know, I'm gonna make it a card div, style div. So now this gives you a React component that you can reuse everywhere, and the styles have been bound to the component itself. So you get the best of everything that we were trying to achieve before, where you have literally a coupling of styles to markup, and you can see the styles here, which literally cannot affect anything else if this CSS compiler thing does its job right, except for itself. And with this, you no longer, and once you get used to it, and once you use this everywhere, you no longer need CSS architecture. Because all this was trying to do was to achieve some sort of, to give the user who's writing markup in CSS some context as to what's going on in terms of the markup and the styles and how they relate to each other, and also CSS and interactions and so on. But once you combine them together, you no longer need architecture. This is all you got, and this is fine. Because, I mean, yeah. And what's great about something like styled or emotion or anything like that is they don't render inline styles. So the final output of this guy actually looks like this. Something like that. And this gets added to the CSS object model within your browser. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's basically this. I'm going to zoom in here. Yeah, architecture. style sheets. Style sheets. Wow, there's a lot of them. CSS rules. Yeah. So document style sheets is basically a collection of styles or link rels or whatever that render within your page. And then for that specific instance, being the style or whatever it is, you'll have rules, this CSS rules list, that are attached to it. So libraries like styled components or emotion and so on, they basically inject their dynamically generated styles into these guys, and that is how the browser knows how to style your stuff because the rules are here. I mean, this kind of idea is not new. Google and Facebook and so on have been doing it for the longest time. That's why their CSS styles always look like arbitrary letters, because they have something that knows how to intercept it, dynamically change it, and inject it into the browser like so. Um, and with tools or frameworks or libraries like styled components, emotion, fancy, and so on, we have the same capabilities. And this is great. The CSS is flat. There's no way that this can potentially style something else because every single style that's being generated with this is unique. And this has a ton of different additional functionality as well. It supports nesting, which is a very common convention that you'd get with preprocessors like Sass and Less and Stylus and so on. So if I had, I don't know, a H1 inside of here, I make it color black. So if I were to render within my card component an H1, hello, this H1 will be black. Let's make it pink. Pink is more fun. So yeah, this H1 will be pink. So you can do something like this. Ideally, what you'd like to do is to do something like this. Styled H1. So the reason why there's no curlies here like this is because the idea for this convention is that it's assumed that these styles will be applied to whatever it is your root is, which in this case is an H1, this one's a div. So now if you do this, you can render your code like this. And now you don't need to write this anymore. And this is how you're supposed to do it. Create lots and lots of little styled components and use those to construct whatever UI that you need. Because now in your React layer, you can literally just think about things as components without having to worry about styles. And styled components take care of the binding between the markup and the styles. And this is fantastic. Oh yeah, some other things you can do with styled components, which is kind of cool. And that is, because this is a string, you can do template string literal stuff where you're able to, yeah, some things are kind of tricky without syntax highlighting. You can do something like this. Padding 20. So you can write dynamic styles like this. So if I somehow gave my card a size of, I don't know, hang on, size equals MD, like that, then my card when this renders, my card now has a 20 pixel padding. Because these are the kind of rules that I've added within my styled components. So this groups really nicely any logic that kind of has to do with UI rendering. It's being contained by your styled component, and then you would use your styled component to construct your primary component. And that is kind of the direction that we're heading into. And using these kind of conventions, you no longer need architecture because there is none anymore. The architecture now is focused primarily on your React and component stack and how it relates to data and how that flows, all that kind of stuff. You don't need CSS-based architecture anymore, which is great. Lots of things to no longer have to think about, and we've had a lot of great success with this here at Help Scout. For the first time, like within all the stuff we're building, within these last, let's say 4 months or so. I've been a Help Scout more than 3 years. And I was originally hired basically to fix their CSS. I was a CSS person. And once I was hired, basically I was a person who wrote, I was the only person who wrote CSS within the company of multiple engineers and designers across different multiple teams. Just fine. I understood the code. I understood how it scaled. I understood how to fix things and so on. But I mean, I understand there is this fear from developers who don't enjoy CSS or don't like CSS or are afraid of it for reasons where they've been burned by it. They haven't, checked out the latest architecture conventions for a long time. Various reasons, and I understand it. So that's why I mean, and because of that, the burden of writing CSS stuff kind of fell on me. But since we've been doing React things and using conventions like styled components for the first time in like say 4 months ago, that responsibility of writing styled things is no longer on me. I think a lot of folks on the JavaScript team feel comfortable, if not super comfortable, then a little bit more comfortable in diving into writing some styles because the chances of it breaking is very, very minimal. And if it breaks, it only affects the thing that you're styling. It doesn't break anything else within the application, in theory. Um, so yeah, it's been very nice. So I highly endorse this era of architecture-free CSS. And if you haven't really followed the stuff like styled components or emotion and so on, I recommend you check it out. It's pretty neat stuff. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a fantastic day. Catch you later. Bye.